Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair here at the Hudson Institute, and it's a great honor today for Hudson to host the Foreign Minister of Singapore. Dr. Vivian Balakrishnan has been the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore for a decade. He's tremendous experience. He's a real medical doctor as well. So his experience is tremendous as a humanitarian, as a medical professional, but last 20 years in particular in politics and leading the foreign ministry of a critical partner of the United States in the Indo-Pacific in Singapore. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Balakrishnan. And I want to invite you to give some initial comments, either sitting down or standing up.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. To be honest, a bit surprised to see so many of you here on an afternoon where you could be doing many things in this lovely place, and including better weather. I come from a tiny city-state called Singapore in the heart of Southeast Asia, 700 square kilometers. So I checked. That makes us, I think, slightly smaller than New York City, slightly larger than Chicago. Except imagine upstate New York ejecting New York City and saying you have to be an independent sovereign entity. I know some people actually want that, but just to give you an idea of the challenges. So in fact, we are younger than the Hudson Institute, which was founded in 1961. Singapore became independent in 1965, and we've had some measure of success in the 6 decades since. So for instance, our per capita GDP at independence was $500 US. Today, I think it's somewhere north of 80,000 US. Not bad for a 6-decade run. Now, of course, the first question will arise, what happened? How did that happen? And I would say the first factor, we would give credit to a hardworking and disciplined people. And if you don't believe me, come and visit Singapore and meet my people. A second factor, competent, honest, pragmatic leadership. Now, I won't get into that. We've just had an election, so I don't need to belabor the point. But there is a third factor that turbocharged the development of Singapore in the last 6 decades. And that actually begins with Pax Americana. And the fact that the real winner of the Second World War was the United States of America. But what was so unusual and remarkable was the fact that America was an incredibly magnanimous victor. Now, just think about it. If you were to Google the top 5 countries or economies ranked by GDP today, it's America number 1. Number 2 is China, which we can spend more time discussing. But number 3 and 4, Germany and Japan, actually were countries that America defeated. So the point is, at the end of the Second World War, America, which constituted 40% of global GDP, rebuilt countries it vanquished, established a rules-based system of globalization characterized by economic integration. Its companies, the biggest companies, the most successful companies in America became multinational corporations, built up global supply chains. Now, think about what that meant for a tiny city-state with no hinterland, no resources, no oil, no gas, nothing, except people willing to work very hard. What it meant was that we could plug into an emerging globalized economy. In the 60s and 70s, This was before the word globalization became popularized. But we were forced to plug ourselves in because we had no hinterland. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this very unusual and unique period in history, where America envisioned, underwrote globalization characterized by economic openness, a rules-based system, and also American support for the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the WHO, actually set a global stage for many countries who adopted models compatible with this system to do very well. And I think you can find books by Herman Kahn, the founder of Hudson Institute, talking about Japan, talking about the Asian tigers like Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So that's the first point I wanted to leave with you, that Pax Americana was a unique, incredible period of 80 years. Many of us benefited. But you would notice that I also made the point that when you look at the ranking of GDP, number 2 is China. And the point here is that, in fact, the biggest beneficiary of Pax Americana. Now, again, start off by giving full credit to the people in China who worked really, really hard to get to where they are today. But actually, like Singapore, except on a much bigger scale, it really turbocharged the development after 1978, when Deng Xiaoping embarked on reform and opening. And so you now end up with today's world. And one other statistic which I want you to bear in mind is that the share of global GDP of America is no longer 40%. It's now about 26%. Now, in absolute terms, American GDP has grown. The American economy actually is the envy of many other economies all over the world. But that relative share has shrunk. And the point I wanted to leave you with is that at 26%, it is a completely legitimate question for the American voter to say, why should Americans underwrite and pay in blood and treasure to keep this multilateral rules-based system, which in fact has been beneficial to almost everyone else in the world? The point is not to be pejorative or to exercise a value judgment, but just say it is a legitimate question. And so that brings us to today. And from a Singapore or Southeast Asian perspective, this is the end of an era. It's no point crying over spilled milk or hearkening for a rose-tinted past. Recognize that this is the end of an era. We don't quite know what the new world order will look like, but what we do know from history is that the interregnum between an old world order and a new world order is when things get hairy, when things get dangerous, and that transition can be chaotic, can be unpredictable, and can be very awkward. And that's the stage we are in right now. After that stage, assuming we survive and thrive, we then get to an emerging new world order, which, as I said, you can't predict exactly how it will turn out, but what it would be fair to say is that we're transiting from a unipolar world into a multipolar world. Where are the poles of the new world order? As far as Singapore is concerned, we expect America to still be one major tent pole. We do not count America out. China will obviously be another pole. But it's not going to just be a bipolar world, because if you add up what's going on in other parts of the world, the EU 27, even minus the United Kingdom, if you add up the combined GDP, it is in that same ballpark between the US and China. And then if you look at India, which is now the world's most populous country, it's already number 5. But I'm also here to make the point that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 of us, if you add up our combined GDPs, it actually gets into the Indian league. And the key point here is that both for India and for Southeast Asia, we do have a demographic dividend. So long as we get our act together, so long as there's no war in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific, or even in South Asia, these are 2 regions where you can expect significant growth. And I haven't even yet included extended discussion into the Gulf and into Latin America, which we happen to believe also has significant growth potential. So that's for the longer term future. Coming back to today, what is Southeast Asia concerned with? Well, number 1, trade and tariffs. I cannot underestimate the impact of the Liberation Day announcements for many, if not for all of us in Southeast Asia. It's not just the headline or the number. The disruption actually goes far deeper than that, because what it actually means is that once you have reciprocal tariffs, country by country, it actually represents a complete rejection of the MFN, or Most Favored Nation principle, which is a key organizing principle under the WTO. In fact, this concept predates even GATT, the Generalized Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, because what it means is that if this becomes the norm, every economic agreement becomes a bilateral arm wrestling match. Bilateral. And not only does this mean a rapid expansion in the number of economic agreements, it also means a world where might means right. And in a bilateral, small countries, small states like Singapore would obviously be at a disadvantage. So that's one. The second point is that because trade is 3 times our GDP, any friction in global trade would have significant secondary impacts on a place like Singapore. And the third point is that we're all watching what happens between China and America. Because, again, if you think about what complete decoupling means, now we hope we don't get there, but nevertheless, there are 3 immediate implications of decoupling. Number 1, it'll be inflationary. Why? Because for 80 years, we've organized global supply chains on the basis of efficiency, competitive advantage. Managing inventories the organizing principle was just in time. If you now prioritize resilience and national security, and if you overdo that dial, by definition, you're no longer working on the basis of cost effectiveness and efficiency. You will not be organizing your inventories on the basis of just in time. It'll be just in case. It must mean higher prices. And that's quite apart from the impact of tariffs on prices. So that's first impact, inflation. Second, if you have significant decoupling, you really set the stage for a more disrupted, dangerous world because interdependence is reduced. And the downsides of embarking on disruption actually are apparently reduced. So you will get a more bumpy, spiky, awkward world. And the third point is, again, I think a point which Herman Kahn would have appreciated, because he was a techno-optimist, is that for at least a century or 2, the world has operated basically on a shared and single technological stack. If you make a discovery, you file a patent, you publish how you did it, you have a temporary monopoly. Others get to work on your discovery. You stand on the shoulders of giants. Science, technology accelerates and accelerates increasingly quickly. In fact, we're now on the cusp of a revolution because of digital technologies, especially AI, the energy transition, and biotechnology. But if, in the name of national security and geostrategic contests, you break that apart, instead of all of us working on a single stack, we are now in two different and maybe isolated stacks. It must mean a reduction in the speed of progress. So yes, we do have fundamental concerns, and I thought I should stop here and take questions, and hopefully I'll be able to end on a more optimistic note at the end of the session. Thank you.
Please. Foreign Minister, thank you very much. You have already addressed half of my questions that I was hoping to ask you. No, don't be sorry. You've gone straight for some of both the big questions about this order that we're in, transitioning through, and what we're going to. You've also started to discuss the U.S.-China relationship, and you've certainly brought up the issue of trade and tariffs, and I want to come back to those issues, but I thought we could start with a question about the bilateral relationship between Singapore and the United States. You were foreign minister, of course, during the first Trump administration, and you, I think, had significant success, and Singapore had significant success with the first Trump administration. I remember the Memorandum of Understanding, updating the facilities agreement, for instance, use. Yep. You hosted the North Korean summit, the Singapore summit, which we'll come back to perhaps in a later question. But you had a very successful partnership. How is it going in Trump 2.0, 5 months into this administration?
Well, let me back up a bit. You know, I started off by saying we were a beneficiary of Pax Americana. But that's in general terms. Yes. But more specifically, on a bilateral level, 60 years ago at independence, Singapore had to make one decision, which is, do we choose a communist developmental model, or do we go for free markets? Fortunately for Singapore, our leaders chose an open economic model. Bear in mind, this is 1965. And what was America doing in 1965, or in the 50s for that matter? It fought wars in Korea, it was engaged in Vietnam. Whatever today's thoughts or sentiments in America about those wars, actually for non-communist Southeast Asia, America bought time and space to prove that this economic model, openness, integration, trade, investments, worked. Second point, if you ask me, and you should ask me, who is the biggest foreign investor in Singapore? And I used to remind President Trump in his first term that America is the biggest foreign investor in Singapore by far. In fact, I discovered at that time that America has more invested FDI, foreign direct investment, invested in Southeast Asia than America has invested in India, China, Japan, Korea combined. And if you work through those numbers, in fact, a big chunk of that is in Singapore. And it's not just about money, but the American investment in Singapore, and there are 6,000 American companies in Singapore, gave us access to technology, to markets, to management. It helped bootstrap and build a level of sophistication in our economy. Now, because of America's engagement, both security and economic, America actually has been a welcome, benign, and benevolent hegemon. hegemon is usually a pejorative term. But actually in Southeast Asia generally, has been a welcomed force for stability and development. And the reason why we've got such close defense ties also is because of that appreciation on our part, that American presence in our part of the world helps provide security, helps provide a stable balance of power, and helps to underwrite the security needed to promote globalization. And that's why you're referring to the Memorandum of Understanding, in which America uses Singapore for logistics support, for rotational deployments. And of course, on the defense front, Singapore used to spend 3 to 6% of GDP on defense. President Trump was quite happy when he heard us express that, because at that point in time, in his first administration, he was trying to persuade others to even come up to 2%. So we told him, Mr. President, we spend 3 to 6%. We have conscription. All the men serve 2 years in the army, in the armed forces. Yes, we appreciate access, privileged access to American technology, but we do not expect America to defend us. We will defend ourselves. So it has been a very close relationship based on trust, based on mutual respect, based on mutual benefit. Fast forward to today, I would say the foundational pillars of that relationship remain. We don't engage, as I said, we do not believe that America is in terminal decline. We do not engage in stone throwing on American domestic politics. We understand even this question about America's commitment to globalization, and I think these are legitimate political questions. So I'm here to reconnect with an administration which we are not unfamiliar with. I've also came to remind, I should mention, I always reminded the president, you have a trade surplus against us. We have had a free trade agreement with America since 2004. Almost all the time you've had a trade surplus and it's growing, and then I used to tell the president, but we're not complaining. Because actually, from our perspective, we don't look at the bilateral trade balance. We look at the overall growth of the economy and the jobs, wages, and Singapore's role in the global economy. So for all these reasons, economic, security, defense, access to technology, we'll work things out even in this Liberation Day tariffs. It helps that we are at 10%, which I think is almost a kind of a baseline, perhaps, revenue-raising measure. We still have concerns about sectoral tariffs, but we'll see how that works out. But what I am reassured is that we're not the primary target of these tariff measures. But I have expressed concern that the secondary impact can affect us adversely. And that's what we need to work through carefully in the months to come.
Well, that's a wonderful answer to a difficult question. You are a secondary target, both in terms of potential trade war, tariffs, and decoupling with China, but also potential conflict. I know Secretary of Defense Hegseth talked about the fact that force could be imminent in the use over Taiwan, for instance, at the Shangri-La Dialogue. So whether the grass is suffering from the fighting or from decoupling, I don't know if you can suffer from decoupling, but how do you see the U.S.-China competition right now, and how this is affecting the region and Singapore in particular?
Well, if you take a step back, I did say that in fact, China since 1978, reform and opening, has been the biggest beneficiary of globalization writ large by America. And that's not to take credit away from the diligence, the the discipline, the planning, and the execution of the Chinese. So look, Asians are pragmatic, and all of us, including the Chinese, know the best recipe for future prosperity is to maintain and keep the peace. No one wants to lose that. Second point is, you referred to Taiwan. All of us have a one China policy, our versions of one China policy. I think what everyone wants to avoid is a kinetic conflict. And having interacted with the principals on both sides, the point I would emphasize is that a kinetic conflict across the Taiwan Straits is not inevitable. It's not inevitable. So then the point is, well, what is the key ingredient that's missing in the US-China relationship? My assessment is the lack of strategic trust. In my part of the world, before you sign a contract, before you have a deal, you need to have a relationship first. And the reason you need to have a relationship is you need to build trust. The Western concept of trust is that you have the rule of law, you've got sanctity of contract, and trust reduces transaction costs. That's the classical economic model for why trust is needed, why high trust societies do well. Well, the diplomatic equivalent is that you need strategic trust between two superpowers or rising powers. Because without that trust, you can't assume good faith. You have to take precautions. And every precaution that you take, I have to worry about it being an increased threat to me, and I have to take precautions, and you end up with an escalatory spiral. So in Asia, it is very hard, and you come to me and say, look, I'm going to compete with you in some fields, I'm going to cooperate with you in some fields, and in some fields we're going to confront one another. I think that's not conducive to relationship building and trust building. So the more phone calls, the more mutual visits, the more constructive efforts on dealing with the global commons. And I was involved with the climate change negotiations. Well, this is obviously during the Obama administration. The Paris Agreement of 2015, I can tell you from personal experience, would not have been possible without convergence of both America and China. And what we do know is that we're now getting into a world where the challenges of the global commons, climate change, pandemics, or even the risks, potential risks from AI, will require cooperation, will require convergence. And it is our hope in my part of the world that you establish a modus vivendi, you build up some reservoir of strategic trust, build up some habits of cooperation, and build up the stores of goodwill between the United States and America, and help us guard the global commons. I hope it doesn't come across as wishful, but this is what we hope for.
Well, I don't think that's incompatible with what President Trump talks about when he wants to focus on deals and economics and trade rather than wars. He wants actually peace, but strong defense to back it up. So we had this successful phone call, this positive phone call with Xi Jinping this week, but he also had the truce tariff of May 12 followed by dissent in relations on trade issues. So how do you assess the trade element of the US-China competition right now?
Well, again, like I said, we can get distracted by exact tariff levels. We can get distracted by the latest headline or the latest tweet. But the big strategic points are this. America and China do need to have constructive economic interdependence. First point. Second point, is actually the domestic and international imbalances were actually not tenable. What do I mean by that? If you were to look at the structure of the Chinese economy, consumption as a percentage of its GDP is much lower than the American share of consumption of American GDP. The Chinese have been investing a lot in manufacturing capacity, clearly at a level that exceeds what their domestic consumption is capable of absorbing. China has become, in effect, the factory of the world. Now, if American deficits, both your budget deficits and your trade deficits, continue to escalate, that's not sustainable either. Now, in a sense, for maybe 30 years, the American consumer has benefited from low-cost manufacturing from China. That's what Walmart really represents. And the surpluses that were building up in China was recycled to buy T-bills, which therefore, in effect, lowered interest rates in America. So you had, at least for a while, a virtuous cycle of low-cost goods and low inflation. But all this was happening whilst you had some very structural imbalances, domestically and globally, in the economic structure of both China and Russia and the United States. You see my point? So yes, we've had a good run, but that run is not sustainable. And actually, there is a need for domestic restructuring, domestic economic restructuring, both in China and the United States. And without that domestic reform, and without the confidence and political consensus, domestically first, it'll be very difficult to arrive at convergence internationally. My point is that politics, foreign policy, and trade policy actually begin at home. So it will take some time. But what you can't do, and I speak here as a physician, most times shock therapy is more traumatic. I prefer elegant surgery.
You don't prescribe shock therapy?
No, no, you see, the point is this. One of the hardest surgeries to do, which I don't do because I only work on the eyes, I operate on eyes, is to operate on a live beating heart. Imagine trying to stitch vessels a few millimeters while the heart is still beating. Well, our economies, you can't press a stop button and say, let me restructure it. Economic restructuring is like operating on live beating hearts. And in this case, in a democracy, every cell has a vote. So don't underestimate the challenge. But from where I sit, don't resort to the reset button or to shock therapy. Make elegant, targeted surgical interventions. Easy to say, hard to execute.
Yes, sir. I want to open up to the floor. Questions for Dr. Balakrishnan. I have a lot more questions, but if there are hands who want to ask a question, raise one. A microphone will be forthcoming, sir, right here up front. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm Nigel, Singaporean, just graduated from Georgetown. It's nice to see you, Mr. Minister.
Have you come home yet, or are you still based here?
I just started working here. So that's kind of what my question is. Yes. In this, related to, in this more tumultuous and uncertain world, what kind of role do Singaporeans abroad have, and especially here in the US, in contributing back home and also to the United States? And what do you have in mind based on your conversations recently with leadership here?
Well, first, I hope Singaporeans like you will continue to have access to academic institutions here. Second, access to jobs, not because I want you to stay here forever, but I do want you to have opportunities to expand your horizons and your networks and pick up new ideas and then find a way to integrate those ideas and networks back into Singapore. So fortunately, but that's where the diplomacy comes in. Just to remind everyone here that we have good and close relations, both economically, defense, security, and diplomatic. And to the extent that that can be used to expand opportunities for young Singaporeans like him, that's part of our mission. So the key point is make sure you're learning something new, make sure you're meeting and expanding your networks, and keep an eye for how that translates into opportunities for Singaporeans back home. I think there's still a lot that we can and should do together with the United States.
It's a very important question for those of us who also teach at university to make sure that best and brightest are coming from around the world to our universities to contribute, that we can learn from, that we can employ in the future if they want to stay here and work for a while.
Yeah.
But I want to ask about the critical technology challenge in intensifying
Yes.
U.S.-China technology race, if you will, including over AI. You mentioned also biotechnology, energy. How does Singapore, how do other countries navigate the need, in the case of Singapore, to be this wonderful open trading hub and at the same time a compliant, rules-based, trusted supply chain provider, if those are two opposites?
It's actually not, well, let me put it to you this way. Let's think about a bank and think about a safe deposit box. Right? If you're going to leave your family jewels, heirlooms, in a bank's safe deposit box, what is it you expect? You expect the bank to be honest. You expect the bank to be secure. You expect it to be reliable. You want to be sure that it will not leak to the box next door, and that the custodian has more at stake in maintaining this reputation than in engaging in either simple theft or leakage. So herein lies the challenge, but also the opportunity. Right? For whatever reasons, domestic politics or economic contest, we know that there will be a bumpy time between the US and China. We know that not just tariffs, but export controls and even access to critical minerals will be part of this argy-bargy that goes on between the United States. Well, what I told my counterparts here is that Singapore does not work on the basis of original sin, meaning I'm not going to exclude a company because it's one of the 6,000 American companies. But I cannot afford to exclude Chinese companies engaged in bona fide economic activities in Singapore. So don't make me choose between American companies or Chinese companies. But having said that, if your American companies have to operate under rules passed here, which apply to their activities in the other parts of the world, do not try to use Singapore as a site where you can engage in a sleight of hand, where you can engage in evasion, or any kind of activity where actually you are abusing Singapore's reputation for probity, for reliability and trust, in order for you to circumvent rules and regulations which you are subject to. Now, I would take the same position for a Chinese company or a European company or any other company. I'm not enforcing your unilateral sanctions or your export controls, but I will have complete transparency, because Singapore's role is to be that totally reliable safe deposit box. So, it may get challenging and it gets hairy, but I think there is still an opportunity for a place that is as rule-bound and reliable as us. So the attributes which I want associated with Singapore are trust and reliability. And to do so in a completely even-handed way. Now, I still hope, for a modest vivendi, because actually a place like Singapore is primed to really benefit for a future where America and China get along. And also a world where the other poles of the world are also at peace and engaged in mutually constructive economic and political relations. So that's what we're trying to do.
Well said, but easier said than done, perhaps.
Easier said
When you
than
think
done.
about high-end chips going to China and trying to stop them, or Chinese critical minerals being cut off and magnets being cut off, and the effect that has on others.
So if you ask me, I think it's a bad idea
Yes, sir.
to try to trip each other up between these two superpowers. But it is not for me to tell you, how to do it. And it is not for me to be abused and used to get around those rules. That's the point.
Understood, and I think that's why the Chinese and American leaders are trying to work out what are the boundaries of this deal, what are the boundaries of competition. There are other questions from the audience, I'm sure. And I still have more. Yes, sir, right here in the front.
There's a mic coming.
One is coming.
Hi, thanks, Minister. I'm Daniel. I work downtown. My question, I want to touch on the trust piece, is do you think that Singapore, you guys clearly love to have a trusting relationship with your partners. Do you think that Singapore has been afforded that same trust from countries like America and China? Do you think that the US historically and I guess recently has treated you guys with the same level of trust that you expect from them or afford them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So far, in our 60 years of existence, I would say we have been able to operate with trust between both us and the US, us and China. And we need to maintain that. And that's why, sticking to rules, being radically transparent, and that's why that analogy of a banker, right? And making sure your safe deposit boxes don't leak is important to me. Having said that, I think behind it, another sub-question behind that question was, do we have any complaints, right? So, yes, we do. After all, and after reminding you that you have a surplus against us, by definition, you shouldn't be applying tariffs against us, for instance. So I can, if I wanted to make a complaint, I can. There are lines that I can pursue. But be that as it may, my greater anxiety is not so much what the US does, but what license American behavior gives to other big or middle powers. Because a breakdown, and I referred to it in my introductory remarks, a breakdown in a rules-based multilateral system and everything degenerating into a series of bilateral arm wrestling matches is inimical to small, open, vulnerable states like Singapore. So that's what I worry about more. The secondary and tertiary effects of a breakdown of norms of behavior, dispute resolution, and ways to conduct business. Norms, rules, policies matter.
These are the two different perspectives in world affairs, though, right? Where you have big powers right now not happy with being bound by rules, and all the others saying, if we don't have rules, how can we help to protect ourselves? And
yes, but you see, America America is a blessed country.
We are.
If you were to go completely isolationist today, yes, you would be less wealthy, less prosperous, progress will be slower. But guess what? You're not going to starve. You're not going to be short of water. You're not going to be short of energy. You've got a continent which has been blessed with natural resources, people. You've actually got great neighbors called Canada and Mexico. And you've got two oceans as buffers. The point is, America can afford to be isolationist. But that's not necessarily the case for other powers in the world. You remember a time when America was the largest importer of energy. And the Middle East was important not just for its conflict, but as an energy resource. Well, the world has moved on. Do you remember the first Gulf War? Iraq invaded Kuwait. It's an interesting parlor game to say, well, if a similar thing happened today, would America feel a need to intervene? Because is America's energy security at risk? The answer is not. Similarly, when you asked about the South China Sea, there are two strategic vulnerabilities which I believe China is most concerned with. You know, for most of Chinese history, it has been a terrestrial, land-based power. When China was at peace and running an integrated economy for over 2 millennia, it usually constituted between a quarter to 1/3 of global GDP. Well, today China is integrated, it's running an economy. We should not be surprised it's number 2 or even a possibility of becoming number 1. What is different, however, in the last 45 years, because China became a manufacturing superpower, it now depends on the maritime routes in a way which it never depended as heavily in its earlier phases of history. So when you talk about freedom of navigation, you talk about trade, you talk about the fact that 1/3 of global trade flows through the South China Sea, and China says, yeah, of course we believe in it. And I mean, it's true. So what is really going on in the South China Sea? Is it really the fish and the hydrocarbons? Is it really the rocks and the sands of the atolls? Or is it really an extension of anxiety, strategic anxiety, and even deterrence between the two superpowers? If that is the real game, that the real core of the issue in the South China Sea is the contest with America, well, let me tell you this. During the Cold War, my Indo-Chinese neighbors will say we became an arena for proxy wars. No Southeast Asian nation wants to allow itself to be a theater for a proxy war again. And we hope the Americans and Chinese sort something out. You mentioned the grass suffering. I think you're actually referring to the African proverb, when elephants fight, the grass suffers. But my favorite addition is to add what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said. He added another line to this proverb. But when the elephants make love, it's disastrous. It sounds amusing, but actually there is a serious geopolitical point there. We certainly don't want America and China to go to war. But if they suddenly arrive at a condominium and split the Pacific, and we end up in spheres of influence or control, that's not necessarily an ideal outcome for us either. We want an Asia-Pacific that is open and inclusive, that has all the superpowers having stakes in our prosperity and therefore peace. We don't want to be forced to choose. but we don't want to be left with no choice either. So it's a bit of a Goldilocks syndrome that we have. You know, not too hot, not too cold.
Well, very important. We got a lot of questions here. I see Will Chu's got his hand up here, and a microphone is coming. Will.
Great. Mr. Minister, thank you so much for your comments. I'm William Chu. I'm Deputy Director of the Japan Program here at Hudson. I really appreciate your words about Singapore's commitment to the rules-based order, as well as the desire not to be taken advantage of in terms of your open and transparent system. And I know that a lot of your ASEAN fellow ASEAN countries also feel the same. I guess in terms of the issues that have been come up recently, in terms of issues such as semiconductor shipments, the claim that Singapore has been used as a way to transit these delicate semiconductors, as well as this transshipment issue in terms of for instance countries like Vietnam being used for transshipment of other countries' goods to the United States. I guess, could you share with us a little bit about how Singapore and maybe some of your ASEAN colleagues might try to address these issues where your openness is being abused, and how you might try to combat this challenge?
Well, I can't, obviously I can't make announcements on behalf of sovereign nations who are my neighbors. But so I'll give you the Singapore answer, right? So on semiconductors, remember there was this question about NVIDIA. And our point is we engaged our counterparts in America and said, look, take a look at the declarations, take a look at the books. We're investigating, and in fact, we did have to take some legal action on some people whom we had queries as to whether their documentation was up to date, but this is now subject to investigation and potential legal action, so I'm not going to get sub judice on that. But the point is transparency, openness, and provide that assurance, and also tell everyone we're not going to tolerate. The other point you're making is about, actually, it's called rules of origin, which every free trade negotiator knows about. And you've got to make sure that the declarations are accurate and that you play according to the rules. And that's the way we operate in Singapore. So you've got to do this consistently, and you've got to build a level of trust. And I think it can be done. And I would say, at least from my interactions so far in the last few days here, that the level of trust in Singapore is high. And that's good. And I need to make sure, both in terms of government regulations as well as the economic entities in Singapore, behave in a way that trust is not abused. So far, so good.
Excellent. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia.
Yes.
Could we talk about the North Korea issue?
Yes.
Last time in the first administration, you hosted the first meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim. On this trip, was there any indication from the Trump administration that they would like you to host it again? And just out of curiosity, you're one of the very few foreign ministers to have spent time with Kim Jong-un. Can you share some anecdotes of what you thought? And the difference between last time and now is that North Korea has a deep relationship with Russia. What's your analysis of that? Do you think a meeting between Trump and Kim could alter that relationship? Thank you.
Well, the short answer to your question is no. And the longer answer is that even the first time round, we didn't put our hand up and say, would you like to come here? What happened is I received a phone calls, both sides. Oh, we would like to meet. Can we come to Singapore? Consulted my prime minister, and he said, well, is it a good idea for them to meet? And to the extent that they're meeting, and if they, for a variety of, I think, diplomatic and security reasons, they chose us, and so we did it. But we're not putting our hand up. We're not offering ourselves. The other point is we characterized ourselves as a host side. We are not engaged in mediation or in negotiations. So the Oriental version of it is that we made sure the teacups were filled, but the conversation was entirely between them. What anecdote can I give you that's safe? I think the North Koreans were quite fixated on parity of treatment and esteem. So they'd ask me, what arrangements have you made for the president? You make sure you give me exactly the same thing. And I think for the other details, you might want to read John Bolton's book. I don't want to repeat it because I have to take the position that I neither confirm nor deny.
It's a great question. I was going to ask it if you didn't ask it because we're coming up on the 7th anniversary of the Singapore Summit.
Yes.
And Hudson is producing a report next week that will
Yes.
talk about the prospects for Kim-Trump
Yes.
engagement.
Which he actually, I should have answered that too. I think time has moved on since the past 7 years. And actually the question of nuclear proliferation now, she goes beyond just North Korea. My own assessment, after all that's happened in the world now, it'll be well nigh impossible to persuade Chairman Kim that it's a good idea to give up his nuclear weapons. But actually that isn't the only concern I have. Because, in fact, you have to ask yourself, what are the South Koreans and Japanese thinking? And for 80 years, the American security umbrella in Northeast Asia, in fact, has been a key stabilizer for the relationship in a complicated part of the world. It's far more complicated and actually far more dangerous than in Southeast Asia. So one adverse effect of this turbulent and uncertainty in rules and security arrangements and trust is that I fear that other leaders will be having unthinkable thoughts. And if you go back to the 60s, this concept of mutually assured destruction, which I think was another of the sort of areas that Herman Kahn was engaged in thinking through. Mutually assured destruction had a few close, very close shaves when there were just two big superpowers, and then yes, of course, you had the French and the British and Chinese. Can you imagine a Northeast Asia with 5 nuclear powers? Russia, China, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan.
Yes, sir. Yes, Minister. I think we are out of time, unfortunately, because we have so much more we could ask you, and I know you would be so generous with your time, but we can't do that to your schedulers. So on behalf of Hudson Institute, Dr. Balakrishnan, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, but please join me in thanking the Foreign Minister.